Pike, and I'm High Ground Gardens, and I've been growing at altitude for over 25 years, and I've been up here in the valley for almost 20 years, and it's a challenging place to grow anything, but things do grow really well here. Just gotta get the balance just right. So let's just get going with this talk. And I want to start with just some basic stuff, starting with garden design. We can't always choose the space that we have to work with, and we have to work with what we have. So there's some things that we can do within that to make the space that we have to work a little bit better. I always like to see the space that I'm working over a period of time, which we can't always do moving into a new space or a new spot, but seeing how things do through the seasons with snow melt and where snow is held, and finding microclimates in that way is very useful to decide where to put our gardens and different garden beds. For instance, a place that holds snow late might not be the best place to put our tomatoes, because that's showing us that the sun is not getting to that area and the ground is holding the cold. So little observations like that are very handy. Is there a clock in here anywhere so I can kind of meter myself? There isn't. Okay.
Jay, can you be his timer?
I don't have one. It's 10:33. I'm glad to. What time do you want to?
Just maybe like give me a signal every 5 minutes or so, just so I can kind of keep track. Okay. Sorry, I had to leave my phone.
My phone's up there.
Oh, okay. Well, anyways, here, we'll do this. So garden design and looking at the land and being able to see it over a course of time before you start investing with all the work. And then, of course, you can do it as you're doing it. You just paying attention and seeing where the cold and hot spots are and where things can maintain more moisture and the drier spots. That's all just observations, microclimates that we're talking about. So, we got slope. Slope is a really important thing. 30-degree slope really contains the solar gain, and that works really well for hot crops. And shade, sun, obviously. Thermal envelopes are something that I found that is really huge. So anytime there's a building or a structure, I found that generally 15 to 30 feet out, especially if it's a heated, climate-controlled building, 15 to 30 feet out from that building, there's going to be a thermal envelope that you can fully take advantage of for hot crops. And I see this continually every season when we get dieback from frost. And then within the thermal envelopes, I'll have a row that runs out 100 feet, but 20 feet of it still contains the plants after the frost event. The rest of the row will be froze off. The row that's up near a building will hold its heat, and the plants can get through frost events. So that's a really big one. So you can use that when you're establishing your gardens. A lot of times if I have a building, I will dedicate the first 20 feet or so to a hot crop, and then the rest of the bed will be something that doesn't need that thermal envelope. And I'll also use it in reverse, where I won't put things that can tolerate cold in the thermal envelope for the same reason. Another thing that works really well is establishing baselines. If you're starting a project, I would suggest that you establish a baseline in whatever way you can manage. Obviously, soil testing is a great place to start. That gives you a baseline from where you started, because when you're years in, or even 5 or 10 years in, it's really nice to look back and see where you started. Then you can do a test at a different time and see how much things have changed. I mean, you can also use soil testing to guide what you're doing as far as your amendments, so that you're not over-amending or duplicating, amendments, or just not using things that you don't need. That works really well. So around here we have a lot of clay in the valley floor. Up on the shoulders of the valley, it tends to be more sand. Something I like to do anytime I'm looking at a new site is a sedimentation test, which is a real simple test. You just take a quart jar and fill it halfway with your soil, and then fill it up with water, shake it up, let it settle out. What that's going to show you is the composition of the soil as far as sand, clay, silt, and whatnot. And that's a real good, just homespun way to look at the soil and to decide how to move as far as with your amendments. It also is going to speak a lot to drainage, and you'll see that by what settles on the bottom of that jar. And if you're on the valley floor and it's this blue Moffat mud, you're going to see that, which that's the drainage challenge that we all face with the Moffat mud. Another thing to do is to let that jar set and settle and then pop it off and smell it, like what's going on in that jar as far as any gassy smells or anything like that. Another thing that I like to do sometimes in lieu of a soil test is to actually taste the soil. And that's a little bit iffy, but when you get used to working with soil, you can actually tell a lot by just tasting it. So I encourage you to experiment with that, and if you're comfortable with it. Fencing is obviously the start of any garden endeavor for us here. We have wildlife populations, especially up on the shoulders of the valley, up where the trees are. The deer and the rodents, the rock squirrels particularly, can be overbearing. This is just a small greenhouse setup that I use for starting seeds, and I like to get pretty intensive in there. Fencing. So a good strong fence really saves all your invested labor, and without it, the learning curve is really steep and it hurts. So I would always start with some form of fencing. It doesn't have to be permanent necessarily, but it really helps to define your workspace and to keep the four-leggeds at bay. And this, I had a situation with a garden where I was having problems with rabbits. This works really good. I have a chain link fence around this garden, and the rabbits were coming through the holes, so I did 1 foot down with 1-inch poultry wire and 1 foot up, and then when I backfilled it, I threw rocks in there as well to discourage them digging down, because I was having a problem with them digging under the chain link. I did this on that spot like 6 years ago, and I haven't had a problem since. It's my most secure spot. Come to find out, the neighbor to this spot was feeding the rabbits, so that was a big issue. And her husband told me that if she saw me do anything to the rabbits, I was going to have problems. So instead of trying to maintain it with traps or anything else, I just did full exclusion. And that site is about a 1/4 acre, so that was a big project to put that down. But luckily, it's a pretty sandy site, so that works really well. I would say that is a good base start, especially if you have rock squirrels and ground squirrels. It works really well. An alternative to this is trapping, which if you have large food installations, trapping can be a part of that. What I found is that when you set up a new garden, especially in a place where there's not a lot of gardens or natural food sources for animals, they find it really quick. And when they find it, they start breeding around that. So they breed to feed. And in my experience, if I didn't do any kind of exclusion or fencing within the 2nd or 3rd season, that garden could be done. Not worth working, not worth investing your time in. So you have to find some kind of balance with the local wildlife population. And trapping in large food installations can work really well, and I've done that to great success at scale with food production. And I know that can be a little bit controversial for some people, but losing, acre-sized gardens can get you on the bandwagon pretty quick. Another thing that I found, and I'll be quick with this because this might be a little controversial too, but if you run a trapping operation and you're generating resource through the rodents' bodies, a lot of times if I have a very large garden, I will set the trappings out on the corner post, and I found that within 2 weeks it draws in the local bird population, and they will come in and actually start helping with the issues of the rodents. And it is pretty amazing to watch, where they get into a rhythm where they know your routine, and when you're out there checking your trap line, you can see them waiting for you to deposit. And that's amazing, just the whole cycle of that and seeing that happen. And I really like to get the local birds to help, because they are awesome, the hawks and the owls. So, let's see here. Whoops, I just said I was going to try not to do that. So soil building is a really big thing here. Our soil doesn't tend to have a lot of organic matter, whether you're on the clay in the flats or you're up on the hill. Similar issue. The clay tends to hold a lot of nutrition, but it needs to be activated with biology, which once you get that going, you start seeing a response from that clay. The clay is actually, I personally, I would rather work clay than sand. I work both, but the clay tends to give more once you get it working really well. The sand is just a drain. It constantly wants to be fed because it just flows through, and there's not a lot of organic matter to hold anything. So the sand can work really well, but it tends to just be a medium where the clay can really open up in a few years and give you a lot of mineral content and everything through activating the biology. Soil and water quality here tend to be very marginal at best in most situations. I find for the clay, gypsum is the best thing that we can do to break up the clay and to get the alkalinity and the salts to flow through. And the water sources around here tend to be sodic and alkaline as well. And that's another insult that we have to deal with. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. You know, I've found a lot of different ways to handle the water issue. I've actually found that when I put the water in a vortex situation where I'm actually spinning it in a vortex brewer, I can generally lower the pH within 2 points just by putting it in a vortex brewer. Now that won't last, that treatment. We'll get a drift back up, which we see if we use acids as well. Everything tends to go to a spot, and then through a course of time, things will drift back up. So managing that is just getting into a rhythm of finding the sweet spot and staying in that wave of balance. So it's never constant. It's just always moving up, but figuring out ways to deal with that. The municipal water sources around here are great if you have one. You know, the alkalinity and the sodic water conditions generally are coming out of the well sources here. The surface water, that's a whole nother thing too. There tends to be a lot of bacteria in the surface water, so that's a whole nother thing, especially if you have animals and you're watering animals. A lot of people around here will try not to water animals out of surface water just for that reason, and try to keep their animals on the well water. So for soil building, one of the things that I've found that works really well, and especially with the clay in the valley bottom, is green manures and plow downs. That is, generally I will use whatever I can get that's available. It tends to be, around here, it tends to be barley and wheat and rye. And putting that in the ground really thick, broadcasting it and getting it up to 4 to 6 inches, and then plowing it down and putting it back in the ground, and then giving a 2-week fallow, and then repeating that process. And generally in our short season, I can get 2 to 3 plow downs pretty solid. And if we can do that, I've found through soil testing that I can raise the organic matter on clay-based soil by 2 to 3 points in one season, which that's pretty phenomenal for not doing anything else. So that's a great place to start. And the way I like to do that is, if I'm feeling super crafty, I'll set a space up where every other bed I'll do a plow down, or I'll divide the space in two, and one half of it will be plow down and soil building while I go ahead and start production that season on half of it, and then you can do a rotation. That works really well if you have the space to rotate. If you don't have the space to rotate, you have to be pretty intensive and do your amendments every season. And outside of that, if you're in a situation where you have to be that intensive, I would just say pay attention to your crop rotations and follow heavy feeders with light feeders. And following that kind of crop rotation, you can usually get away with applying like compost and amendments every 2 to 3 years, which that's a huge thing too, because if you're trying to do those applications every season, that can be expensive, but it's also a lot of work. So you want to try to spread that work out over the course of 2 to 3 years, and then pay attention to what you need. And then if you feel like you need something more within that time span, you want to address that with amendments. And one amendment that I found that works really well is complete organic fertilizer. And I got this idea from Steve Solomon, and he's a well-renowned author, and you can find plenty of information and books by him. Complete organic fertilizer is right here. It's just a mixture of amendments, and it's put together in a specific ratio, and that works really well for solving fertility issues within the 2 to 3 year amendment applying cycle. So if I have issues within a bed, I'm going to address it with COF, or complete organic fertilizer, because I can get an immediate response out of that versus trying to apply compost, because the compost is the long game, and the fertilizer amendments are the short game. And then I have some handouts here. I'll just hand these around. I put a seedling mix on here that I've been using for a long time, and a transplant mix. And these mixes both work really well for soil blocks as well. I love soil blocks. I don't use them all the time. It depends on, the level of work that I'm dealing with. But soil blocks work really well because they tend to air prune your plants. And the plants will grow out to the edge of the soil block and stop, and they won't circle around like they will in a 2-inch cell. So with soil blocks, you have a lot more grace with time period. Oh, I lost my picture. There it is. So you have a lot more grace with time period for how long you can hold your transplants. And that works really well for timing, with putting things out, holding things. Another thing with transplants is at scale, at larger scales, I like to, the timing is crucial, and I like to get my timing so that I'm not having to up-pot thousands of 2-inch cell seedlings, and I would rather go directly into the field with those. So the timing is extremely crucial on that, and a lot of times I will do 1 or 2 or 3 successions before and in front of and behind my plantings as well, so that if I have an issue with losses due to rodents, or if we have a weather event, then I have some backups. If it's an important crop, that's how I would deal with that, just having backups. I would rather have to cull plants than not have a full stand. So here, I'll just pass these out, and you guys can kind of share these, and if it generates any questions or anything. Yeah, here we
It's
go.
10:50.
What's that mean?
You just wanted to know what time it was.
What time is my time up?
Till 11:30.
Okay, cool. I think we're doing good. So I encourage everybody to check out Steve Solomon. I first got in touch with him through a book called Growing in Hard Times. He just recently came out with another book that I haven't gotten yet, but he has been, he's the founder of Territorial Seed Company, and he has a lot of really useful information for nutrient density in food. it's one thing to just grow a plant, but it's a whole nother thing to grow a plant that's nutritionally dense and delivers all the mineral nutrients and everything that we need, which is lacking a lot because our soil is so depleted. So green manure and plow downs, that's great. Animal manure and compost is another thing that's a big part of getting the organic matter up and going. If you're using manure, it's good to use a season in advance, just so that there is no contamination concerns as far as semi-digested or raw manure splashing up on plants or stuff like that. But if you just use a well-aged compost, that works really well. I'll give a quick plug for Compost Technologies, Mark Ennis. He has always delivered an excellent product for me, and he's out of Center, and you can get a hold of him, and he can deliver compost as well. Gypsum is a really, really good amendment for the clay, and that's easy to find here in the valley. I've already brought up the COF with Steve Solomon. That works really good in garden applications and containers. It's universally effective there. So living soil, super soil, that's a thing that everybody's talking about, and that's something that I've been doing for a long time. There's a little bit of a difference between the two methods. Living soil tends to be a more natural and self-replenishing thing. Super soil tends to be a little bit more charged and defined, and you have goals when you're using super soil. I like to use super soil in containers, and especially small containers. Like if I have a lot of containers and I don't want to be messing with 5 or 7 gallon containers, through the super soil I can use a smaller container, and that's where I like to use that. The living soil is not quite as charged as super soil, and that lends itself to a larger container and or to raised beds. Top dressing is really popular and very effective, and I like to encourage people to do that, but I personally like to take the top dress method and do what I call a spike. And with a spike, I'll take a dowel and I'll make, so this method is generally for container usage. If I was going to use this in a garden application, I would be using a fertilizer applicator, like say on a Earthway garden cedar, and banding it next to the plants. It's kind of a similar idea to that, but for container production, you take a dowel, and you push it down and make a hole in like the outer 1 or 2 inches of your container, wiggle it around, pull it out, and then you're going to put your top dress mix into it, or what I call my spike mix. Spike mix can be pretty simple. I'll use a veg mix or a bloom mix, which for my veg mix I'll just use like 50-50 nitrogen and kelp meal. So nitrogen source could be blood meal, bean meal, whatever is handy and you can get and is available. For a flower mix or a bloom mix, I would just use bone meal and kelp meal 50-50. And then I would put that in generally for, I would start a container, like if you're working under a 5-gallon container, I would do 1 to 2 tablespoons per spike hole, and then I would do 2 to 4 spike holes per container. Now this system has worked really well, and I've done complete organic tomato production with just the spike system. I'll start with a charged super soil and run a 5-gallon pot, and then do the twine and trellis method and run them around in circles. And with this method, spiking every 2 months, I've been able to run the tomatoes for 18 months. Solid, without stopping and without starting over. Now I decided at 18 months to go ahead and replenish the plants because they tend to get a little grown out and tired over time, and the vines get really long. I think at the point at 18 months, I think I was at 40 to 50 feet on the vines, and that was 2 tomatoes coming out of a 5-gallon container.
What kind of
There were many. That was over a course of years. I developed a greenhouse tomato production operation. So till, no till, double dig. I like the idea of no-till. I find it a little hard to obtain up here. We're just so dry, and our season is so short. That's why I tend to like to split my space either into alternate strips or split the space 50-50 because you can get a season ahead on soil building. I'm not against no-till. I tend to till. I tend to focus on biointensity and market production. So I just really need to have a high production, and the no-till way tends to be a little bit of a slower process and more of a natural farming technique. So there's just a balance that everybody's going to find there for themselves personally. I tend to be biointensive and get as much out of my space and work as I can. Double digging is another thing that works really well. I find that works really well if you've got the inclination to deal with it up on the shoulders of the valley here. And double digging is just basically digging out a trench in your garden bed, and then I like to set up like a 1/4-inch screen and roll the rocks off, throw the dirt on, roll the rocks off, and then once you have all your dirt sifted, that goes back in your hole, and then you just do the next one. That's pretty intensive for most people. If you can figure out how to do that, those will be your like forever best garden beds. And those are the kind of beds like if you don't step in your beds and you step in one of those beds that's double decked to 2 feet, like you'll never do that again. So another thing that I found that works really well here is a broad fork. That's about as close as I'll get to no-till, as I'll broad fork a bed and not run the tiller through it. The broad fork generally just helps with vertical tillage and opens things up vertically, so I can throw down compost and then go through and broad fork a bed and get a pretty good integration of the compost and aeration of the soil vertically without doing the whole flip and till action. Another thing, I've worked garden sites that have the blow sand and all the baby head boulders and rocks, and I did a couple double dig installations in that site, but then what I figured out worked really well is the Ruth Stout method, lasagna gardening and building up. I had one garden that had an arroyo that was 4 feet deep through it, and I filled that arroyo with all the rocks from the side as I was cleaning it, and then I did a Ruth Stout right off the top of that. So I leveled that arroyo and then just started with cardboard and compost and grass and just built that up, and that's a pretty forgiving system and it works really fast, and first year production on that can be great. You just want to make sure that what you're planting into is not being digested. Everything below it is digesting through the season. This works even really well for getting an early start because the digestion process of that bed can create a little bit of heat. It's basically a compost pile. So your top layer, you just want to do a blended compost soil, so that you're not too hot on the top, and that works great. And that just keeps going. You just keep adding to that over the years. And the beds come up instead of going down. Compost. Compost is the basis for everything we need here because obviously we don't have a lot of soil fertility or biology. So building soil and building compost go hand in hand. Building compost on the shoulders of the valley, up in the trees, is quite a commitment. It's a commitment to the wildlife because to properly manage a compost pile takes quite a bit of maintenance. The proper balance for a compost pile is 20 to 30, or let's say 25 to 1 carbon to nitrogen. And that's kind of hard to understand, but if we think of that in terms of, so say I have a 5-gallon bucket of kitchen scrap, then conceivably I'm going to need 25 buckets of straw, cardboard, leaves, whatever we can find that's locally available and easy to access to balance that. That 25 to 1 might be a little low depending on how rank your scraps are, kitchen scraps, or if you're using fresh manure. If you're not following a proper dynamic on the nitrogen to carbon ratio, then you're not creating balanced compost, you're creating vegetable manure. And when we're creating vegetable manure, that tends to be a very strong attractant to rodents and four-legged deer, animals, foxes, raccoons, the whole nines. So if you are getting serious with compost, a fence is imperative around that area to do right by the wildlife and keep them out of your pile, and not domesticate the wild creatures. Even so far as to like a top line of electric wire for bears. Bears are a big thing, and even a well-tensioned, strong, tight fence won't always stop the bear. So a little bit of electricity can help quite a bit with that. So feedstocks for compost can be, generally we want to find things that we have access to and we don't have to haul too far. Greens, garden waste, kitchen scraps, weeds are a great thing. These are all nitrogen sources. The browns or carbons could be straw, paper, cardboard, wood chips. I love wood chips. If you use wood chips, they have a lot higher carbon value, and I think that the conversion there is about 500 to 1. So using softer forms of carbon such as straw or cardboard or something like that, 25 to 30 to 1, whereas with wood chips we're looking at 500 to 1. So those wood chips are going to be a lot longer at breaking down, but they're very useful, especially if you do like slaughtering of animals and you have a lot of really hot nitrogen going in there. That can be really helpful. I am not adverse to putting animal parts in my piles. In a well-managed pile, that's no problem. Here's another thing I'd like to share too. Dynamic accumulators is a really interesting thing. So this is a little chart that I'll pass around, and this is just kind of mocks the periodic table with the elements that you can get out of things that we can find locally and around. Worms. Oh, I forgot to keep up with this. So red wigglers have been my go-to, and it's about the only livestock I really like to keep. I don't mind working with livestock, but keeping livestock for me is a whole nother thing. So that's my livestock right there. There they are working. You can see how sandy that soil is too. Okay, here's one of my compost operations. So that's how we get the kitchen scrap to the site. We use 5-gallon buckets. And I'll usually let my collection pile up until I have about enough. I think that's about 30 buckets right there. And I'll generally do about 10 buckets on a layer of a 5 or 6 by like 8 or 10 foot big pile there. And there's some cardboard being used in the compost. Some pictures of the compost. This may be a little scary to some people, but I wanted to share this. I found this to be very effective. This is a bear board, and you can find the design for this on Department of Wildlife. And it's actually a humane way to help guide the bears away from anything you don't want them getting to. And I'll tend to use this like in front of a gate or any place that a bear could climb over, and extremely effective. They find this once and they're generally done. But it does not harm the bear, even though it looks terrible. They're pretty tough. My irrigation manager. This is just some soil. I was doing a test hole on a field project, and this is out in the middle of the valley. And you can see the alkali that's on the top of the soil. And then that soil looks pretty good, and that's just because it's moist. This was in the spring. As soon as it dries out, it's going to be really dry and tan looking. And here's some compost application, just kind of showing the process there. This is a SLV Bolito bean project I was working on in 13. So that carbon to nitrogen ratio is really important to keep the wildlife from being totally attracted to your piles. I really think the compost production, it's a pretty big responsibility to do it and to do it right by the animals. So as long as you're keeping those high carbon values, you can do that. Another thing I like to do too is to just bury the pile in carbon. And then when I'm ready to add again, I'll pull off the top carbon. And what that does is that helps contain all the nitrogenous odors. And this is magenta spreen lamb's quarters, Johnny jump ups, some garlics. And then again with the red wigglers, bins work really well. And bins are simple. You can find lots of designs for those, or you can purchase a bin. You can even make bins out of totes or 5-gallon buckets. But they also work really well with piles. I'd encourage everybody to keep a pile. The worms have no problem overwintering in a full-size pile. A full-size pile being at least 5 by 5 by 5. You have enough density there, enough insulation. The worms will just go down in the winter, and then they'll come back up. And the piles work really well. It's a hissing beetle, garlics. If anybody wants to interject with questions, there's no format here, so just pop up.
So you mentioned challenges with timing, and do you ever use any techniques like, the old farmer's almanac to, sometimes they try and time when they're planting, by something like the phase of the moon, or do you try any of those techniques?
Absolutely, yeah.
Can you repeat the question just for the mic, for the recording's sake?
So,
There we go.
okay, oh, great, thank you. So I asked if he ever uses some of the old techniques in the farmer's almanac for the challenges of timing of when to plant in the spring. So, and then the farmer's almanac will mention things like phases of the moon. So without getting too deep into that.
Yeah, that works really well. There's a natural pull that we can access through working with the phases of the moon, which definitely helps to pull up the seeds and to work that way. One thing that I want to say about timing, and timing being crucial, that's a really good point. And it's so hard for everybody to temper themselves right now. Everybody is chomping at the bit, and especially people that are new to this area. We still have 2 months of winter here. Now, we might have 70-degree days, but we could have a winter weather event at any time up until June, and we probably will. We always do. Last year, we had unseasonable 120-day season, and that was on the back end. It went really late, and that was great. And I feel like that we're starting to see that more with warming and stuff. But this is a real tempering this year. We're going to have a late start because of what's happening. And it just keeps us all really grounded. So one way I like to observe the timing is the local green up and the natural green up. So the natural plants that are around and what's greening up, that's what we want the rodents to feed on, and we don't want them to feed on our gardens and our plantings. So if we're planting before green up and we don't have good cats or like rabbit-proof structures for our seedlings and that kind of stuff, then we're really shaking the dice on doing a salad bar for rodents. And that can be, it can shut you down so fast. And one way to deal with that is through successive plantings if you're doing direct sowing, or successive plantings with transplanting. But the moon phases in concert with green up would be what I would be looking at. It's so easy to get really excited early and to lose your steam. Purslane is an awesome dynamic accumulator. It grows really well here. It's everywhere. It's actually great food. It's high in omegas, and it makes great shade hats when you're in the field. This is burdock, very, very beautiful. Just looking at stuff there.
So which vegetables do you have the best luck with around here? What do you grow to sell? And
I grow between 80 and 100 varieties a season of different things, so a little bit more like, I mean, that's pretty broad. Everything grows really well here. I mean, there's some curves figuring out some stuff, but I think it would be easier to say what doesn't grow well here. And what would that be? Long season crops, obviously. We can do a lot with appliances and protecting things from the cold and stuff. I've done a lot of work with appliances. I tend to stay away from it and stay at scale. More field and farm scale is where I like to be right now. But personally, if I'm going to use row covers or any types of appliances, I like to do it in the fall. Using appliances in the spring is a little bit different because we just get such high winds in the spring. And, with row covers and that kind of stuff, it's really challenging. Low tunnels work really well in the spring. Plastic over a 3 or 4 foot hoop right on your bed, that can take us up to zone 5 easily. So I didn't quite answer your question. But
so you can grow a whole range of vegetables if you change the microenvironment.
oh yeah, we can grow pretty much anything here. It's the only thing that we really can't grow is like long season stuff, like long season corns, for instance.
How about melons? You grow melons?
That's a good question. You can grow melons. Getting them, things that are hard to grow here are just going to tend to be smaller. And I have done well with melons, and I have offered melon seed. I'm not this year, but I have in the past. And the melons that I've done well with are musk-type melons. And I've done really well just direct seeding those and treating those as a field crop. The one thing that I have not had much success with, this is peppers in a low tunnel with a plastic mulch. Those did pretty well there, is watermelons. I've tried and tried with watermelon. I get small melons, but getting anything tasty or anything with viable seeds is a whole nother thing. That would have to be, I have not gotten that yet. This is Spilonthus. Tomatillos. How are we doing on time?
It is 11:14, we're gonna stop at 11:25.
Okay, so let me kind of,
You mentioned using worms in a pile. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
yeah, it's basically you're just running a compost pile and introducing worms to it. And then the worms will cycle through your waste. And once you put them in your pile, you've got them on site. And even if your pile moves, you're going to find them. They tend to go into the ground and be all over. It's just a great way to cycle your waste. And they do so much great. They turn everything to pH neutral pretty much. And a lot of humic acids and enzymes come from them as well. Great livestock. I encourage everyone to get worms and to go with that.
Do you have a suggestion for worm count per cubic feet?
No. In my approximation, the worms are going to take care of that in time, as long as they're fed. What I see over the seasons of adding, the worms come through the compost into the beds as well, and then you just start seeing them, and kind of my gauge for that is when your beds are getting full of worms, you drop a trowel in there, you're finding worms every time you do that, and that's kind of the gauge I use.
I have a question about your soil testing.
Yes?
So when you're talking about smelling and tasting the soil, what are you looking for that's good and what's bad? I mean, what do those smells and tastes mean?
What do you like when you eat food?
Will you repeat the question?
Oh, so he was asking, what do you like when you taste soil? What tastes good or what tastes bad? And it's the same parameters as anything we eat. Is it bitter? Is it sweet? Is it flat? I mean, but when you do your soil test, taste your soil and then look at what the numbers are on your soil test, and you start gaining a personal knowledge of what you're looking at. I mean, if we're working with the alkali clay out, you're going to taste that alkali, that salty alkali. It's an Armenian cucumber.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So are you seeing any invasive ladybugs? I was reading an article about this.
No, I have not
ladybug.
seen that.
So nothing's showing up
That's a
over
good.
there.
That's a good point, because we haven't had a full freeze out in many years now, and for me, I mean, historically a full freeze out was -40 here, but I haven't seen that in, I don't know, 15 years or so. So I expect that we're going to be seeing different pressures that way, because we're not getting full freeze out. So things are being able to overwinter and stay longer. You know, I want to touch on a couple things real quick, and then I'll open up for questions completely. So aerated compost tea, that's awesome. It's great. However you can figure out how to do that. Soil drench, foliar, however you do that. I mean, it brings so much usable microbiology right away to the soil and the plants. But I've also found, and I've worked extensively for decades with the aerated compost tea, but I'm starting to find that anaerobic brews work just as well. They tend to be stinkier, but don't be scared of those. So the dynamic accumulator sheet that I passed around, that's where I would start for making brews. So you look at that and say you want to do a nitrogen brew, you would pull something off of there that you can find locally, and you would do an anaerobic brew out of that. You know, if you wanted to do something for a flowering or bloom time, you'd find something that had phosphorus and potassium. And that sheet will kind of allow you to just see what you can find locally, and then just do an anaerobic brew on it. And the anaerobic brews, I always tended to stay away from them because the thought back in the day was that anaerobic was bad. It's not my experience anymore. I'm not scared of anaerobic brews, and honestly, it's easier for me than ACT. So, especially at scale, it's way easier to run anaerobic. And I think it's a little easier to run anaerobics through irrigation as well. Now, that's a whole nother thing, and I don't necessarily want to tell you that running inputs through irrigation lines is the way to go. I'm not going to say that. I tend to just run water through my irrigation lines, and then have dedicated lines for running inputs. And that just takes out any problems with building up microbiology within your lines and having plugged up emitters and all that. So irrigation, I'm a huge fan of T-tape. Check that out. It's easy to find. DripWorks is a great company that I've always used for that. And if you don't have irrigation, look into it. Don't be scared of it, and be prepared to find another hobby besides watering.
5-minute warning.
Okay, thank you. I think that's pretty good for now. I'll just open it up to questions if anybody wants to ask.
Can you come use the mic because we're recording this? Will you please come use the mic?
We want to reach the 800,000.
Run, we only got 5 minutes. Come on.
This applies to the world.
So we're in Creede, Colorado,
Okay.
and so we can't direct sow.
Okay.
So we're doing transplants. What's the best way to harden those transplants out before we take them out?
That's a great question. So hardening is a process that can take, a few days to a week, and you want to start by just exposing them to air outside their nursery space, air, wind, and sunlight. So you want shade, and you want to break the wind, especially in the beginning. It's really important to break the wind. If you don't break the wind on the first day, they're just going to get dried out and desiccated. So it's just a matter of doing that over time and slowly bringing up their exposure to wind and sun. And another thing I want to say is, don't give up on direct seeding. Don't give up. You can direct seed in Crete. Absolutely. You'll be surprised.
Come up here. If you got a question, go ahead and like line up so we can.
Yeah, come on
use
up.
the mic and move through it.
You mentioned humic acid. Could you give a brief understanding of that, what it does?
It just tends to potentize and charge up anything that we're using it in as far as soil biology or nutrient or amendment mixtures, and it tends to make things more available. That's a very general statement, but that's how I see humics. Goji berries have done great for us. If you do get into goji berries, you have to net them. Otherwise, the birds will not allow.
You mentioned using predatory birds to control your rodent problems.
Yeah.
And so you're basically like laying out the dead rodents from your traps to attract them. Have you tried building habitat for the birds?
No, I haven't really. I mean, in a sense, I see laying out the food for them as creating habitat.
Yeah.
And the way I would do that is the 4 corner posts of my plot is where I would lay these offerings out. And I mean, within one season, those posts turn white and red from blood and bird poop. Any more questions?
Do you have anything to put towards aphids? We've struggled with aphids the last 3 years.
Yeah, aphids, that's something that I've seen increase here in the last few years. And there's something that we've just recently been exposed to called the hemp aphid, I think, and it's a big, white, super meaty aphid. Aphids have always been really one of the easiest things for me to handle, and I've always handled them with Dr. Bronner soap and water. Generally, I do like a 1 to 4 tablespoons per gallon of water, and then do a spray application, and that tends to dry out the aphids. Give that a shot. Aphids are easy to control.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions, feel free just to step up to the mic.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.